Welcome everyone. Today we're going to talk about Zoda, which I think is one of the most potentially most powerful results in the field of data availability sampling for years, and it could have massive implications. So we have with us some of those cracked researchers in the space, Guillermo, Alex from Bain Capital Crypto, and Nash Q from Celestia Labs, to unpack all this and tell us what it means for Celestia and for the space as a whole. So why don't we start off with just quick introductions from each one of you guys, and then we can dive in.
Hey everyone, I'm Alex. I do a mix of research and investing at Bain Capital Crypto. I like to say it's whoever will have me on any given day. I think in writing this paper with Guillermo, my time on the research team is probably expired before I get kicked back to investing.
If only you could hear me laughing.
Your turn, Guillermo.
Oh, it's me now. Okay. By the way, far too kind of an intro, Nick. Most of the things that he said are lies, but a little bit of this is the truth, which is I guess we do actually do research on DA. So I'm Guillermo. I'm the chief scientist also at Bain Capital Crypto. Luckily, I work with Alex a lot on these kinds of things, and someone memed it before we were able to say it, but a lot of our work is taking stuff that people know and turning it into linear algebra, and then seeing where it goes from there. And shockingly, that turns out to be quite useful, as I guess we'll discuss today. So also apologize, it's a bit early for me, so I might be quite babbly for now.
That's perfect. Hi, I'm Nash Q. I'm head of research at Celestia Labs, looking into how to make nodes huge and fast, and how to make Celestia huge and fast and nodes tiny and cute. That's one of the main focuses, and the other one is ZK counts and interoperability between all the rollups. So those are the main focuses of my research.
Thank you for your service.
Awesome. So let's get started, because I think start off with just like a high level overview of what Zoda is, because I think a lot of people here may have just maybe seen the tweet but not actually gotten the time to dive in and learn exactly what it is. It stands for Zero Overhead Data Availability. So that gives us a little bit of a hint, but Guillermo or Alex, why don't you guys give us the high level of what Zoda is?
All you, Alex.
So Zoda at its core is what we call in the paper a proof of encoding. And it might make sense to stop and ask what a proof of encoding is. The essential ingredients to data availability sampling are that you want people to know that some data has been published, in the sense that they can download it, but you don't want to force everybody to download the entirety of the data, because that's inefficient. So if you want to have really big blocks while preserving the ability for nodes to have this guarantee, you need some sense in which you can download some subset of the data but get a global guarantee. That requires two things. One, it requires you to know that the data was encoded. In other words, that some redundancy was created using typically an erasure code. You need to know that that was done correctly, right? Because you could download little chunks of the data, but they could be meaningless if indeed the things that you were downloading didn't correspond to some sane redundancy. In other words, some sane error correcting code. And then, of course, you need to know that enough people are performing data availability sampling. In other words, there exist enough light nodes, in the case of Celestia, on the network such that enough data has been downloaded through these samples to reconstruct the original data. In Celestia's case, this is the original data square. So Zoda addresses the former, which is we want to know that potentially a malicious publisher of some data or a leader in some consensus committee has indeed encoded some data correctly using an erasure code. There's many ways of doing that. Celestia today does that through fraud proofs, where somebody encodes that data, a bunch of other people download the data and recompute the encoding, as well as the Merkle tree corresponding to that encoding, which commits to the shares that light nodes will then sample and download. And they check whether the result of their encoding matches what was published by the leader. And if they detect some discrepancy, they can identify that discrepancy and alert light nodes in a compact way of an error. And that turns out to be a great scheme. It doesn't impose any prover overhead. I mean, we obviously consider it practical enough to be deployed in Celestia, and us being very excited about Celestia. We felt that this was one of the candidate schemes. It's maybe the earliest one that was proposed in the original data availability sampling paper that Mustafa co-authored. The other approach that a lot of projects have taken has been using KZG commitments, which essentially function as these rateless codes wherein you impose quite a bit of prover overhead, but enough, it's low enough for it to be practical, where we essentially compute, in some sense, a zero knowledge proof that the encoding was done correctly. Then when people ask for samples, they don't need to assume that they're connected to one of n honest nodes in order to be alerted to fraud. They know that in some sense the encoding was done correctly, and that their samples, assuming they verify, match that correct encoding. So the issue with this one is that it imposes a fair bit more prover overhead and then also requires a trusted setup. So the general schemes that were available to us when we started looking at this were, one, either they had a trust assumption in the form of either a trusted setup or the requirement that one is connected to one of n honest nodes in the case of fraud proofs, and impose some form of inefficiency, either redundancy in the case of fraud proofs where everybody needs to, all full nodes need to download the data and recompute the encoding, or it imposed a, and typically additionally, it also imposed a bit of, in the case of KZG, a prover overhead. So we try to look at this in a variety of different ways, and Zoda is a scheme that we think offers a new path, one that has fewer trust assumptions and significantly less overhead, both in the form of, ideally in certain schemes, lower redundancy, but also significantly lower prover overhead than we observe with other schemes that are used in practice.
Guillermo, do you have anything to add?
Yeah. I mean, so exactly what just like Alex said, right? Laid out the problem very nice in the DA setting. I think maybe pushing a little bit specifically on what Zoda is here is it is two things. It is this proof of encoding that Alex mentioned, and it's also, you know, this particularly useful thing for Celestia in the sense that, you know, it's kind of a proof of the fact that things were correctly done by the encoder, and therefore that people can download subsets of the data and be guaranteed that in some sense it is okay. What's very weird, and what I want to like really drill on, because this is actually like kind of personally like quite fucked up, is Zoda achieves this property, right? Normally the way we do this kind of thing is somebody goes and computes a bunch of stuff, right? They compute an encoding, for example, in the case of Celestia, or in the case of other computations, they do some other complicated thing. And then they go and compute a proof that that thing was done correctly. So there's two things now. There's like this, you know, encoding, and there is kind of a proof, right? This is this case in KZG and some other schemes. And then they give everybody that proof. And then they say, cool, now if you take a look at the original kind of encoding that I've done before, the encoding is okay because here's a proof that it is good. What is very weird about Zoda, and is one of the things that we didn't even know was possible until we kind of wrote this, is it is possible to make the proof part of the encoding itself. In other words, there is no proof. Like the thing itself is its own proof of its own correctness. Like there's nothing else. There's no like separate thing you have to do to like ensure it is correct. Like this thing can only be constructed if it is constructed correctly, which is very weird. And it is a property that I don't really know that many other systems have, and has like deep implications for how kind of we do data availability sampling for exactly the reasons that Alex was stating. So, you know, it's cool. It's funny because it's rare that you have both like a very practical thing, which this thing feels like it fits, but also has this other property that theoretically it's very weird. It is very rare that you get to say like, you can construct a thing and that thing is its own proof of its own correctness. Like it's a very weird, magical kind of like almost spiritual thing to say, although it's true for nearly silly reasons. But anyways, just want to like keep that point around because I think we'll probably come back to it a few times in the coming next hour or so.
Yeah, it's almost as if like data availability sampling and snarks like had a love child. That's something that I tweeted earlier this morning.
Yeah, it's something like that. I mean, there's something really strange about the earliest construction that Mustafa described in the original data availability sampling paper was like 90% of the way there to what is called the Ligero prover, which is a hashing-based snark prover. Like the work that was being done to create the extended data square was itself almost a proof. And certain things, like maybe it's not that surprising in hindsight. I mean, it certainly shocked us when we first noticed it, but because certain things work really nicely, like you had these really compact fraud proofs, you didn't have these really complicated fraud proof schemes that are sort of typical in general computational settings, like how long has it taken the major rollups to ship the fraud proofs? It's become almost a meme. It's actually quite tricky for general computations to do it in a way that's efficient. But for this very specific task, it turns out that you had a pretty efficient and very natural fraud-proof construction. You take a particular row or column of a matrix and you check whether that thing is exactly included in some code. And if not, then you automatically have an error. So maybe that was the hint all along, but there was just something much more interesting in Mustafa's original construction than maybe even that paper describes itself. And that was the major surprising insight to us, is that you can amend that thing ever so slightly, which is all Zoda does. I mean, it's basically almost one-to-one what Mustafa originally wrote, but it achieves this additional property, and it feels like we get it almost for free.
I guess the other thing is that when you zoom out a little bit, that sampling and verifying a proof looks kind of similar, right? Where currently we sample 16 samples in the square, and we check if the share is included. And we do that and we get our availability guarantee. And similarly, to check the correctness of the encoding, we do something similar where we check rows and columns if the corresponding encoding is done correctly. So there is a very close beauty how DAST is similar to verification of proofs.
So Nash, I actually maybe it would be interesting to go in a little bit into the differences between the current most common data availability sampling schemes, or I guess encoding schemes like KZG and fraud proofs, and like why has it so far made sense for Celestia to stick with fraud proofs over KZG? Like what is the lay of the land? And I guess Guillermo and Alex can also chime in here, but I think that's important because that kind of lays the foundation for why Zoda is such a improvement, or such a change.
Yeah, I guess you can split the scheme of data availability into many stages. And the first stage would be the sampling part, where the light nodes do the sampling and check individually if data was available. And then the second part is reconstruction. And that's not really talked about much, where you need all those samples to be then collected. Reconstruction has to happen, and then you have to give missing samples or a fraud proof out. And it makes sense for Celestia to start off with fraud proofs. The alternative was doing KCG commitments, where proving is taking a lot of time. So you're basically creating a polynomial commitment over each row and column, and you need to create an opening proof over each entry and store that proof, which is additional overhead. And all of that does not need to happen in fraud proofs. So you basically only do the work that you have to do, which is creating the erasure code and then creating in our case, an NMT, a Merkle tree over the entries. This incurs a overhead in finality, because now you have to wait for a fraud proof to get to agreement. And agreement is a very tricky property that we want to have in data availability networks. So when you look into agreements, what you want is all light nodes to come to the same end state. And the whole network should agree on the final state, right? And when there's one obvious attack that was also mentioned in the paper, which is called a selective disclosure attack. So I can give samples to a specific set of nodes, and that type of attack is fixed by using anonymized sampling. But there's also the other way, where you could sample something but not receive a proof, right? And at that point, there might be the case where we fall back to reconstruction. And this reconstruction part is the one that's very extensive and can take time, which is the downside of KCG. But using the normal scheme that we are doing, we would then, if there are two options, right? If the row that I sample and I don't get a proof, either it's badly encoded, or I need to reconstruct the square and then I get the sample. So there is some additional wait time, which every data availability scheme has. So no matter if you have validity proofs or fraud proofs, in the end, you might have to wait for reconstruction time. Yeah.
So there's a kind of a bunch of different trade-offs between these various schemes. Like some of them are like, I guess you can have faster finality or come to agreement faster, or you could have higher or lower overhead for the block producer or for the sampler, or for full nodes. And I think those are like a kind of like important things to think about. And I guess like I kind of want to. I'm hoping that Dave joins us soon, because I think one of the coolest parts about Zoda is how it can unlock like whole new levels of scalability in these DA networks. But maybe to like lead us there, or to get us like prepared to talk about that, Guillermo or Alex, do you guys want to talk a bit about like how this can, like what does the zero overhead mean in terms of like scalability? Like why is this not just like on the surface, it's just like, oh, it's a validity proof-based encoding scheme, but actually underneath, it sets us up for some much more interesting approaches for like the scaling aspect of these networks.
Yeah, so Guillermo had this quip on the Zero Knowledge podcast a while back, and his hypothesis was that there may exist special purpose zero knowledge proofs that can be unreasonably fast, right? We've known this for a long time, right? In general, the ZK space has been building general purpose provers, things that emulate general purpose chips, for example, or ZK EVMs or ZK VMs like RISC-V VMs and the like. These allow you to do general purpose computations in well-known languages. That's when we've been investing a lot of time as a ZK space in. However, we've always known that building highly specialized circuits for a very particular task can be more efficient. The question was always, how efficient can we get? Like, is there something that gets us, and Guillermo had a really nice tweet on this the other day when we did the announcements on Zoda, how close can you get to bare metal, right? How close can the proof get to the underlying computation? And Zoda is at least one example, and the only example that I'm at least aware of right now, where that is almost zero, where computing the thing and proving that the thing was correctly computed take the same amount of resources for the prover. So this is where the trade-offs normally that you would see in zero knowledge proving systems from a scalability standpoint is, yes, you remove some redundant recomputation, but the prover overhead is typically in the thousands for general purpose compute. So if you had thousands or millions of nodes doing something, yes, you would get some savings from that. But it's really only in these environments that you require incredible amounts of verifiability. Of course, you could do things like parallelize and so forth, and people are trying to get us as close to real-time proving using that. But from a cost perspective, like how many resources you're expending, it's still very substantial overhead. Zoda doesn't have that. And it's really interesting that it just so happens to be also applied to the setting of data availability, where in an ideal world, we want to be able to have really large blocks. In other words, be doing very large encodings over lots and lots and lots of data. And we want to minimize the redundancy. We want as few nodes to be doing that. And we'll talk with Dave a little bit later, not to steal his thunder, about the possibility of no nodes actually touching the entirety of the data, which is taking this to a different level. But at least for now, the very first instance is, it's not just a validity proof scheme in the generic sense. It's a very special purpose one that genuinely, from a prover standpoint, and indeed from a verifier standpoint and network standpoint, doesn't impose any pure overhead from the proof.
Yeah, again, this is like also getting back to the original thing, which is, it's very rare, like there's a natural question, right? You like build I'm just going to reiterate kind of what I was saying here in just slightly different languages. Like, how do we think about when we do zero knowledge proofs? Like, okay, cool. We do a computation. That computation takes some time, and that's like very cool. And then we spend about 1,000x more time proving that the computation was done correctly than actually doing the computation itself, which is fundamentally what makes kind of, currently, right, is why we can't run arbitrarily difficult things on, ZK machines, ZK VMs, or really even circuits. Right. The second that you've kind of taken your problem, which is a very specific problem, and you've formulated it in the language of circuits, or formulated it in the language of, whatever ZK VM ISA du jour, right? You've kind of incurred an overhead from doing all of this stuff. The arithmetization incurs overhead. Actually proving incurs overhead. All of this stuff has like additional computation that has to be done. This is true, by the way, even in things that feel like they're very specific, like in KZG. So, for example, in KZG, while encoding the data square takes, let's say for a few hundreds of megs or tens of megs, it takes maybe a few hundred milliseconds on a laptop. Actually proving the correctness by doing these kind of KZG proofs that like every individual element was encoded correctly It takes a very long time, like many thousands x overhead over just having done the computation itself. What's very magical here, and this is the quip that Alex was referring to, is that kind of, we can avoid all of the overhead of taking a computation, arithmetizing it, putting it on a ZKVM, and then proving stuff by kind of going as bare metal as possible, by going really down to what is exactly the thing we are solving for and designing exactly one protocol around it. And it turns out in this very special setting, which is exactly for, as it turns out, kind of by luck, the setting that Celestia is interested in, there exists a protocol which allows you to prove interesting things about this encoding while requiring no additional computation. In other words, having done the encoding and doing the encoding in a way that is provably correct have almost no difference in terms of computational time. And this is not just kind of in theory, but this is concretely the case as well. There's some stuff around fields which we can maybe get into later, but fundamentally, like, they're identical, which is very weird, right? I know very few ZK proofs where there actually is essentially zero overhead over having done the original thing.
What's kind of cool is that, like, kind of the magic that makes Stark's work is that you don't actually have to prove your computation or your erasure code's exactly correct. You have to prove that it's super close to correct. It's kind of the exact same thing that's going on in DA, which is kind of what makes this so efficient and work easily.
Yeah, I remember actually in the early days when we have been thinking about how to, achieve validity-like properties without having to change our it's like still using just Reed Solomon and not having to do KZG. We thought about using Starks or Snarks or something to just prove that the encoding is correct. But obviously that we were always ran into like crazy overheads with hashing, or just in general, it was very clear it was going to be very, very difficult and very expensive to prove. So it's kind of mind-blowing that it's possible to do this with basically zero overhead. But Dave, now that you're here, I think we can transition to talking about, I think, the really amazing implication of Zoda, which is so-called, I think Nash coined this term Dave sharding, which is sort of like a play on dank sharding. But tell us a bit about like how you see Zoda and the fact that it has less overhead. It gives you like encoding validity and a bunch of these properties, and therefore can enable new approaches to the data availability, like sampling networks, to make them significantly more scalable. And like, just how scalable can you see this getting in theory?
Yeah, you guys are too kind with the naming here. Yeah, it's actually so cool that data availability or data inclusion is this very nice thing of you don't really have conflicts. Like, imagine we break a protocol up into 4 committees. Committee 1 saying data is included doesn't conflict with committee 3 thinking it's included. Whereas for swaps, people can get different prices for stuff. But for data, you don't. So kind of one goal we should have is, one goal is improve data throughput, DA throughput. And today we're bottlenecked on the Celestia construction requires the block proposer, one block proposer, to have all the data. And that block proposer has to communicate the data to every other validator. And you get this attestment that every validator has received the data as part of your DA guarantee. But you don't actually need this. Fundamentally, you should be good enough if you know that any 2/3 of the validator set could reconstruct your data, or any given percentage. 2/3 is kind of magic number for unrelated reasons as far as DA is concerned. So what would it take for us to kind of start that process, and how far can it go? Well, We could start the process with, let's imagine we have like one chain, and let's break it up into committees. Let's say that there's 10 committees of 10 validators each, and each committee kind of makes a block and gets DA. Each committee makes some block of here's DA we think we have, or here's we have, and then they send DA shares to every other validator, all the other 90 validators. So then we parameterize that, hey, if we get any 2/3 of these, we know anyone could reconstruct that committee's block. So if you sort of parameterize for this world, your throughput's already massively improved. You don't need to parameterize in the throughput of everyone downloading all the data. You've already gotten into a world where it's like everyone has to have DA shares all the data. And then if you increase the number of validators, you're directly increasing scalability. Like we have to reparameterize kind of how we think about proof of stake a little bit. But if we do a roadmap getting Celestia to say 1,000 validators, this then means that you can be 10xing or more actually more than 10xing kind of your total bandwidth here, or your total throughput. Now, why can't you do this today? Why is Zoda a key thing? Well, you have to kind of know. Today, there's this. If we want to do this pre-ZK proofs, committee 1 makes an erasure code of data, but then you try to share that to other people. Everyone else has to kind of know that this is a true erasure code, not just kind of garbage, not just like a bunch of random data. And the direct way of doing it, what we do in Celestia right now, is you re-download all the data and then like check that is it a valid code. That inherently, by definition, requires downloading all the data. So now with Zoda, this like ZKP, you can just get a segment of the data and know that it's really a true erasure code, which then gives you these, which then means okay, the data in hand is valid, so now I can start. So then it's my only question is, do enough people have shares of the data? Not is the code itself a true erasure code? So we couldn't even imagine this paradigm prior to getting ZKPs here. And then Zoda in particular is an extremely cool construction because it's basically zero overhead. It's kind of what you minimally do already. Now, oh yeah, I want to pause there. Does that kind of make sense for how far can it go?
It does make sense. Keep going. Keep going.
Okay. Yeah. So then, how far can we go with this? Well, what's one key insight with like when you look at if anyone's ever looked at kind of cloud billing, especially like on GCP, you have or just how the internet works. You have very different bandwidth numbers for like bandwidth between two nodes in the same data center or two nodes in the same country, or like the closer nodes are, kind of obviously the faster they can communicate because you're actually speed of light bound. But also you can talk at much higher throughputs at the same cost. Like if you go to the GCP numbers, like in GCP you have to pay Google Cloud Platform, like their equivalent to AWS. You have to pay for bandwidth at different rates if you're talking across continents than if you do in the same continent or in the same data center. And this is like factors of 10 to I think in one case like 50x price differences, and bandwidth differences. So you can get to consensus much faster on data that's in a committee that's near each other and at much higher bandwidths. So if we start imagining we partition consensus to getting a DA guarantee for like first maybe like US East, US West, Central Europe, West Europe, East Europe, etc. First, and then you get this more gradual like global. So there you can get very high bandwidths in like a given region really fast, and then as like 500 milliseconds or a second goes on, and that data gets DA shared across every other region to get your today's DA guarantee, you can get much higher throughputs because you don't need like your gigabyte of US West DA to be sent to every other validator in like Africa, Asia, Europe, etc. You only need shares that data to get sent, which is much smaller, and it gets smaller as you have more nodes. So we can actually get to this really interesting world where the amount of bandwidth you have across continents is actually also much smaller than what you can like get within a region. And here even just paying for that bandwidth is actually hard. Like you actually have like hundreds of terabytes per second between South Africa and like Europe, but how much of that can you pay for DA? Like getting to a terabyte a second per second, that's actually hard. Well, but now we could imagine we could, like, as a whole Celestia network could afford, like, I don't know, 100 gigabytes a second between Africa and Europe. This roadmap can let you get DA throughputs that are still higher than 100 gigabytes per second overall, because we don't need the Africa to Europe communication to have all the data. You have some data that's in Africa, and DA shares for everybody, so as a user you could reconstruct the data that you care about, but you don't need all the data to be in every node in Africa, especially not instantly. Like, some of the data could be downloaded over time or something. And so we can get throughputs that are faster than the actual cross-continental bandwidth we can download.
Wow. Well, in Guillermo's words, that's deeply fucked up. Does anyone want to add on or comment?
I mean, yeah, totally agree with Dave. Yeah, fundamentally, the thing is, like, this enables you to do something that wasn't done, you couldn't do before, right? Like, right now in Celestia, we have to download the whole block, and yeah, it has to be unencoded, which is like very nice and incurs no overhead for the prover, but everybody has to download the whole block. But the point is, not everybody cares about the whole block. In fact, most people really don't care about the whole block. They only care about a guarantee for themselves, and then a guarantee that the thing that they got, in other words, their own data, was correct, right? And if you expect that there is some, the amount of overlap between different regions in terms of transactions is not particularly large. It could be large sometimes, but on average, it's not particularly large. In some sense, what we get is we get these like localized systems which receive a guarantee about the entire block by only downloading very, very few entries and only those that are relevant to them. And the zero overhead part here is also very important because the proof itself kind of only depends on how much they care about sampling, how much security they want. And then number two is what things they want to receive guarantees about, namely the transactions that happen, within a specific region or even within a specific wallet, right? You could imagine that, there's a whole thing about every wallet should be a light client, right? You could kind of do the same thing here, right? Everybody can not only have their own data and be sure that their own data is indeed the one that's included in the block. So if you want to read your account balance, that's great, but also have the general guarantee, almost cryptographic, depending on how much you're willing to download, that indeed the data is good, and you don't rely on trust trust assumptions about anything else for security. So this allows you to kind of do this thing that Dave was saying, which is, you can now split up regions, right, such that the bandwidth within a region is very high, and therefore everybody can download stuff, very quickly within that region, and then have other regions that there will be some connections, but those can be slower, and therefore you end up with weird properties where, like Nick and both Dave said, which is the throughput of the system is larger than the throughput between any two kind of regions. But you can imagine the same thing holds true at both a very small level. So this is, the joke is true decentralization has never been tried, TM, until now, which is people who have relatively small nodes can also receive similar guarantees to those who have very large ones. And they can kind of do whatever they want with that amount of security. So this is wild, right? Like, all of this stuff has weird, second order implications that are kind of hopefully of interest to everybody. But
I mean, the region specific stuff has another huge advantage. There's this like local decentralization aspect. Another one's just like super low latencies. Like, a lot of the intent and solver stuff, I think, is starting to be driven by latency things. But you can imagine that, just like for stocks, there's a Europe market, an Asia market, etc. For any intent that's like cross-chain, there's fundamentally, like, you can have solvers in the same region as you who could solve it first. And hey, if no one solved my like trading demand in, I don't know, say 50 milliseconds or 100 milliseconds, then this graduates to global consensus that, okay, now go try to solve my intent at like global consensus in 500 milliseconds. So you can get this like advantage of centralized or very geographically centralized systems for latency at first. And hey, if no one solved you in the very like like physically near you, then graduate onwards to global consensus, which is, so it's kind of like you see centralized exchanges and like market makers around that really co-locating around a city or country. Like I don't want to go to names of things, but like you have a lot of perps things that are like in one area in the central region of Japan, or Binance servers in like one region, and then everyone sets up infrastructure around that. But this actually disservices anyone who doesn't want to take on, Japan or like a given country's risk. So instead, we get this more utopic world of, okay, people can be anywhere they want and get super fast clearing where they are, and then, hey, if you didn't get cleared within a price or within some guarantee you're happy with, okay, great. Now you get the whole global clearing at just graceful latency, kind of with no extra work on your behalf. This like gradual DA system is kind of giving you this already by like, hey, here's some local DA guarantee from your committee, and if you don't get solved there, at just natural internet speed of light delays, it'll get broadcasted to all of the entire world, and then you could get filled there by someone in some other part of the world. But you get this like locality first, and which has this inherent speed differences just due to the speed of light.
Nash, as the person who coined the term Dave sharding, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, it's pretty exciting. I mean, what both Dave and Guillermo said, having this gradual data availability from local to global makes a ton of sense. And you as a person in a local system can get that DA guarantee quite fast. And the interesting part is, because you only have to download a fraction of the block to get the validity guarantee of the erasure encoding, what you just did is dramatically reduce the resource requirements to be a validator. And when we naturally think of separating the block producer and the attester, you can see a way where you can have tons of attesters signing over or coming to consensus over one particular encoding, and all these attesters don't need that big of bandwidth requirements or hardware requirements. And then, ironically, if the proofs get low enough, and currently probably a little higher than our current light nodes, you could even think of light nodes participating in some kind of communal data availability attestation, where we basically then go full circle and have our light nodes running and have home stakers, which is yeah, kind of funny. But so there's a clear path of, if we want to increase the number of validators or the number of attesters, how to do that, because of the asymmetry of how much you have to download for the verification versus how big the block actually is.
By the way, you joke about the home stakers thing, but it's real, right? Like, look, to verify this thing is good down to cryptographic security, you do not have to download the entire block. Like, this is crazy, right? Like you have a gigabyte block, which is very cool and large, right? And you would, the first thought that comes into mind, which would come into standard blockchains, is like, crap, I have to download the whole block and check everything in it. And the point here is like data availability plays so nicely with this thing that it actually tells you, cool, you want your 100-bit security guarantee, just download, in the case of a gigabyte, I don't know, it's going to be something like 40 megabytes for the block. And yeah, fine. Like 40 megabytes for every 10 seconds is too expensive to do on a phone. But look, a modern laptop with an even decent internet connection can 100% do that. So it's crazy, right? It's weird, and we should kind of keep that all in mind as we're like continuing to talk about this, because it the joke of like, the home staker, the noble home staker who's doing it, but it's like, wait, but it's not so much of a joke anymore when this is kind of possible, right? When you don't have to download a full gigabyte's worth of thing to actually verify it. And this is the like future we are tending to. TM.
So I have a question. Is there something fundamental about Zoda that enables us that for example, a KZG scheme could not? Or is it only just that KZG is like higher overhead for the block producer? Or is it, or is there something more, like this like distributed block building itself? Like, go ahead.
Yeah, to this idea right now, as far as we can tell, the overhead for KZG to do this at extreme levels of scale is somewhat limited by the prover overhead. Now, you could imagine, of course, that all these validators in these different places, like you've strapped on some GPUs onto them, and because they're only touching, let's say, individual rows and columns, you take on a bit more overall work at the network level because they don't get to exploit nice amortization for a bunch of openings, but you just eat the cost and accelerate it locally. Now, of course, that's not really a great home staker setup, unless some of our gamer friends would be so nice as to run nodes for us. The reality of KZG, I think for now, at least as far as I can tell, is that it would be tricky. It's certainly, you could do distributed encoding much more naturally. And I think Dave's original post on the Celestia forum, at least the follow-up, did contemplate something like this. What's cool about Zoda is actually that you don't have that. And it's basically what Dave said at the beginning. Starks noticed this idea of you can check that something is really close and get a global guarantee from that. Turns out DA basically realizes the same thing. Both Starks and DA are based on properties of Reed-Solomon codes, and in particular this one, which is that it's okay if you're not totally right and you're really, really close to something that's right. And that allows us to utilize essentially a similar observation and to get something like Zoda with very low overhead on the prover side. Now,
Alex, you muted yourself. Just FYI. I think you were still talking.
Oh, crap. I don't know what happened. What was the last thing you heard?
You were just saying now, yeah.
All right. Yeah, that was maybe Guillermo muting me. He's like,
I was like, no, it's done. That's it for you.
The censorship regime at Bank Capital Crypto. It's appropriate. It's appropriate. He knows I can go on a tangent. But yeah, my point of view on this is that for now, I think it's going to be fairly tricky to do this without some zero overhead protocol. My guess is that ultimately the constraint isn't going to be compute, it's going to be bandwidth, just reasoning by complexity theory and just the realities of most mature systems are like this, are ultimately bandwidth bound. So in the ultimate calculus, it probably matters less, but it's certainly in the near term, these prover overheads are just too much to enable something like this, unless you have truly zero overhead schemes.
Nash, were you going to say something?
No, I was just keeping my mic out.
Sticking your neck out. Nice. One question I had is, in this, one of the differences between the scheme compared to just like the DAS that Celestia currently uses, versus Zoda is like for the sampler, like the light node, they have to sample entire rows or columns, and so I'm wondering, like, is that not like some kind of higher overhead, or does that like change the randomness of this sampling scheme, or like I don't know. I feel like that's kind of a big difference here, and I'm curious. I guess also just to tee up Nash for later. Like I'm curious. Like, would Celestia actually adopt Zoda, or does it need some changes, or what are the trade offs, and like how do we think about like actually putting this into production? But go ahead, Alex.
Yeah, maybe Nash, do you want to go over the practical stuff? Just I was going to make a brief comment on Zoda.
Make your comment. Make your comment.
Yeah, so this full rows and columns thing, it turns out, I mean, on a pure, it doesn't contribute to overhead, right? Because all of them are useful samples. It does contribute to larger node sizes. I will note at least one of the KZG constructions that we looked at that are used in practice today do also do full rows, full columns, just because it's more efficient for them to do that than to open up samples for the entire row and entire column. They generate what's called a multi-proof for entire rows. And so it's comparable in that regard. So they try to do that, I think, to save on computation. And as a result, like their samples are still very useful, but you end up with these bigger nodes ultimately. So in the absence of recursion, for example, where you can get back to sampling individual entries, which we can chat about, is one technique, for instance, to get the nodes smaller in Zoda. You would have larger nodes. That is like the main trade-off in like the Zoda TM as constructed right now. The major trade-off that it has is that each light node needs to download more data than an equivalent KZG scheme, for example, or the equivalent fraud-proof scheme. There's ways of getting that back down, recursion being one of them, having nodes sample, of course, not to 2 to the negative 100, but 2 to the negative 7, and then you need to have some good guarantees around them being consistent with other nodes that, only get, 1% guarantee, as opposed to like enough guarantee that even if somebody ran a computation until the sun burned out, the thing was correct. So these are more nuanced discussion. It actually is somewhat relevant to this point on what needs to change in Zoda and what exactly makes sense to use in production today. I will note Zoda, as stated in the paper, is a really fascinating theoretical result that can be applied in 50 different ways, and different protocols make different trade-offs, and as a result will benefit from different configurations and flavors, so to speak, of Zoda.
Yeah, well, exactly. The fact that Zoda can come in that many flavors is then now a question of, okay, which approach would be the most practical one for Celestia? What we did is we started doing some benchmarks, and we hit a roadblock when we realized that for the soundness guarantee, we need to operate over a GF 128 field, which means that in the current construction, we are doing it over 16 or 8 in our current library. But there is a library that we found by, I think Binance is using it, that has fast Fourier transformation for 128. So we can test that out in Rust. And there's also a RSD2D library for the erasure code construction, which will give us better benchmarks. So this is like the one thing that has an asterisk if Zoda is going to be in production or not, is if we can get the erasure coding fast enough, right? So there are like two camps. One is saying that erasure coding over 128 field might be too slow, but we might be able to hardware accelerate that to compete with the more optimized versions that we currently have over the 16 or 8 field. And the other part is more on the light nodes. where you can think that I, as a Zoda verifier, when I do the sampling, you can think of a Zoda verifier being like in between a light node and a full node. I, as a Zoda verifier, when I don't receive a sample, I don't know if it is badly encoded or if it is not available, right? It's basically the same thing conceptually. So you would then wait and fall back to reconstruction. And if it is badly encoded, which might happen, which is fine, right? Because we are not relying on having the whole square correctly encoded. Even if there are errors, you can still get a unique decoding, which is what Zoda proves. You now need a secondary mechanism to figure out the agreement property, right? I am now stalled as a Zoda verifier, and if the Zoda proof passes, then I'm all good. I'm done, right? But if I'm stalled, there are those paths that I have to now explore, and I, whole as a network, need to agree on the state. And one thing that we're exploring is basically what Alex said, is doing recursion. So what if we have the Zoda verifier and then put the Zoda verifier again a CK proof over that and just prove the verification? So now we prove that the verifier correctly verified the Zoda proof, and we get a succinct proof that gives us agreement instantly, because we will wait. We will basically block on this proof the same way KCG would block on this proof. This would incur some overhead, because now you do a recursive proof over the Zoda verification, but might be worth it if you want to get agreement faster and faster finality for light nodes, which also then decouples again the validity of the encoding and the sampling, because in the current Zoda scheme, the rows and columns that you sample serve two purposes: one for the data availability, and two for the correctness of the erasure code. Theoretically, now you could have this recursive proof that shows you the validity of the code, the erasure code, but then separately sample the 16 samples that we already do.
So are we just talking about the light node architecture here, not the within consensus as well?
Well, you can, like, there are different, like, again, many flavors how you can do it. If consensus does the recursive proof over the Zoda verification, then we can also just send this recursive proof to consensus participants, or let consensus create this proof for light nodes to download. You can do that ad hoc during reconstruction, where a full node might give you this recursive Zoda proof, and then the proof of reconstructed shares to a row, or do it in consensus. Still exploring what the best solution here might be.
Do you think apps care that much about time until the light node network has all the data, or do they care about consensus having a DA guarantee, and then they're fine with the light node guarantee emerging after 10, 15 seconds. Like they'd be happy.
Yeah. So I guess power users or the apps, they just want the fast censorship resistance and the fast DA guarantee. So immediately, what we are getting. I'm thinking here now more of the perspective of the end user who is interacting with an application and might be, I don't know, I'm at the vendor and I'm buying myself a bottle of water. Then I might not care about some certain guarantees. But the bigger the sum, maybe, though the bigger the purchase, I would wait until I get certainty for some finality. Yeah. I don't know what's realistic, but like the end user probably doesn't care at all. But I'm always on the mindset that we should care for the end user. And if we get the best guarantees and the most trust minimized way, the fastest, makes the whole network more robust and less complicated.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I guess it feels
What's your opinion? Yeah.
I feel like the number one goal for people is getting confirmation snappily, and then getting a insurable guarantee of like, hey, if this doesn't hit the light node network in 10 seconds, like there is some punishment for the counterparty who gave me the guarantee. So there's like and then you can have software that measures the punishment versus value of what you're doing, and kind of the worst case here is that like, oh, you're doing something so valuable you wait 2 seconds, which is not that bad for if someone's trying to do $1 million action. Like I think them waiting 2 seconds for final confirmation is okay, but then for everyone below that, like getting something really fast is what they care about. And so if the global light node network delay is like 10 seconds, maybe that's fine, because you can kind of get the failures should be happening earlier in the pipeline. They get faster responses.
Yeah, and you get this ability to do sampling. So because of the scaling laws of this thing, even if it's square root, but if you do recursion, maybe something smaller even, if you wait until you get more data and sample more slowly, then you do sort of confirm that something will be included with some economic guarantee, then you can get significantly more data. In fact, the longer you're willing to let the light nodes wait, the more you can do. Kind of it is almost analog to this idea of fast blocks, slow squares that Celestia has been noodling on for a while. The other side of it is, of course, like if the light node finality is tied in some sense to the user's eyeballs for some action. In other words, you're waiting for something to fully confirm before rendering whatever you need in the app or whatever, then I could see that being more challenging. But if it's purely about the guarantee, then you can get a lot of bang for your buck by doing things a little bit more slowly.
Yeah, so like all this overhead of like recursion stuff feels like it's it feels like having consensus do this and taking 2 more seconds for the light node pipeline is actually totally fine. And even like recursion across the overhead of Zoda for within consensus, like the bandwidth overhead actually doesn't feel that high. Maybe my numbers are pegged towards lower security targets. Actually, one of the craziest things that when you, Alex and Guillermo, were telling me about Zoda first was that was his justification for why like 8 to 10 bits of soundness was actually okay here. And I've never. Do you want to touch on that a bit more? Of like, I just thought that was so interesting.
Yeah, in the consensus setting, you can get away with a lot more. Guillermo, go ahead.
Oh, I don't think I've said anything yet. But go for it, Alex. I do have something to add on that at some point, but go for it.
This is your moment.
Yeah. So what's interesting, and honestly, what was actually quite difficult with this particular paper, is that in some ways, this is a very weird way of thinking about security and succinct proofs. Normally, right, like a succinct proof is provided to you, And the second that you have that, you have like 100 bits of security. What is cool is you have 100 bits of security. Like, you have a thing, you have like some pretty complicated thing you've just worked on and proven, and you receive a little proof that's like a few hundred kilobytes or whatever, and you know that this thing is true with extraordinarily high probability, assuming certain things hold or whatever. What's weird is it's not interactive, right? It's like you just receive a thing and that convinces you of the truth of the underlying statement. What is very cool in DA setting is that you don't only get that, but you also get to request, random samples or random things from the person who is hopefully telling you the truth. That randomness, right? So if I sample a few things and Alex samples a bunch of other things independently of me, right? And I trust Alex to tell me the truth if he receives something bad, and he trusts me to tell him the truth if I receive something bad. Then in some sense, right, like it's the same as if us two as independent entities sampling, say half of the items. It is roughly the same as if we were both together and sampling like, 2x the items that each of us sampled. And this essentially gives us something weird where it's like, look, if you have probability, let's say 1 over 1,000 that something is incorrect, if Alex and I sample things simultaneously, we actually have probability 1 over 1,000 squared. In other words, 1 over 1,000,000 that the things that we're sampling are correct. And so this is very, very powerful, right? Because it tells you there's a trade-off now. You either have a lot of people who are all each very small, but there's a lot of them, right? And each of them gets a very small guarantee, let's say, 1 over 1,000. But if there's enough of them and enough of them kind of are all interacting together in a special set of ways, then we actually receive a very, very strong guarantee, even though each individual person had to download very little. On the other hand, if you are the only person in the world and you want to be really you don't trust anybody else, and you want to be really damn sure that actually everything is cool, you can download a big proof, right? So you can do your own sampling, which will require you to sample a lot more things, but you can be very sure that everything is good without requiring trusting in anybody else. So the consensus setting is particularly interesting here because by construction, consensus only works in, let's say, PBFT style protocols if 66% plus one person are honest. And so because we're already making that assumption, it is well worth investigating, right? It's well worth thinking about the fact that maybe now each person doesn't have to be 100% sure that each of the things that they receive are correct down to cryptographic security, for example, but instead that it would suffice for them to trust 66% of people in the consensus committee to kind of relay them if anything goes wrong, right? And this gives you very, very strong guarantees about what the actual underlying proof is, while everybody has to download fewer things. So it's weird. It's now this creates a sliding scale of trust, and in turn, a sliding scale of how much everybody has to download based on what assumptions we are making about the people in this network. So, and this is another point to bring up. Sorry, go ahead, Dave.
I was gonna say, philosophically, it's just kind of like this. We're already trusting people anyway in consensus. This is kind of the name of the consensus game of trusting people's statements around what they receive from other people. Like this is exactly what's going on in Tendermint or BFT systems rounds of voting.
Exactly.
And here this is actually more detectable than all the issues in consensus anyway, because in consensus you can't really argue like, did you actually receive 2/3 of votes from other people, or like but here we can, because if challenged you can show the signatures, or you can be forced to you can be forced to demonstrate that you received all the things, all the DA shares at some later latency if you say you received it and there's an issue. So it's like, why?
Well,
Okay.
like the challenge part is kind of tricky because you get into the fisherman dilemma if you do it for availability. But you can, like, there are other schemes. Honestly, it would be good. So I would be pushing back a little bit on an honest majority trust assumption, because if I can reduce that assumption to not having to trust the committee, then I would prefer my light nodes to have that assumption.
Yeah, I think it's different from the light nodes, though, just to be clear.
Yeah.
I think the argument is there's a difference between what you as a consensus participant need to do in that setting and what a light node would be. And actually, the point is that
I see.
you might actually want to be closer to a light node than to, a full node. And the reason for that is that in that setting anyway, in order to have safety to begin with, you must have 66 plus 1% of the nodes agreeing, for instance, that they received certain data, that data that they received was well encoded. Does that make sense?
Yeah, but I don't need that guarantee to check if they did it correctly. Right? This is just...
Yeah, I mean, if you want to sound
2
to the negative 100, you certainly are welcome to. And you will get exactly that. You're going to get 2 to the negative 100.
The light node guarantee is totally separate from consensus is maybe another part of the point of especially imagine pipelines and stuff. Like we probably will have to do some re-encoding for all of the light node people. We break consensus into committees. Each committee does some encoding, and then we make some global code with some basefold style tricks at some delay. Hey, that global code and light nodes queries, that global code will have different guarantees and within consensus for DA. And ideally, consensus throughput should be as close to the literal redundancy we want to guarantee that hey, any 2/3 of these people have gotten enough data shares for reconstruct the thing. And in order for that DA argument to hold true, you have to kind of believe. I have to believe Guillermo and Alex's claim if they're other nodes that hey, they received some data. So why don't I also believe their claim that they received the data? They received a correct encoding guarantee as well, instead of myself doing all 100 bits and taking that extra bandwidth overhead, 100 bits of security.
Yeah, and also, what if I told you, Dave, that when you're ready, you won't need to be doing the re-encoding?
Oh, baby.
That's
it gets spicier. It's good. It's good shit. Anyway, sorry. It's a good.
There's a nerd snipe here where we can, in an ideal world where we do some form of distributed encoding with some accountability inside of some consensus committee, you could still have your global encoding and also do this form of subsampling that Dave is talking about.
Oh, okay. I'm excited to one day learn this nerd snipe. I was thinking it would be.
Oh, you're getting roped into this, Dave. Your name's on it now.
Is this new work? Is this going to be a new paper?
Yes. I think I told you about it very briefly, but we're not ready to say anything yet about it, in public.
Okay.
But it's very spicy, and it will be hopefully hot off the presses in the quite near future.
Sounds even more
it's going to get
deeply fucked up.
We already achieved zero overhead and real-time proving of encoding. What's next?
Oh yeah, it's gonna be good. Anyways, okay, so onwards.
So I guess we're coming up on. We have 15 minutes left, more or less. So maybe we should start talking a bit about where we go from here. I guess you guys already were touching on that, but I feel like no scheme comes out perfect the first time, and so that and usually, I mean, obviously with Zoda specifically, it's a big innovation that kind of blows the doors open on what is possible that we could even conceive of. I am speaking. Can anyone hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay. Yep. And so I guess I'm wondering where do we go from here? Where has Zoda illuminated new areas of research to look at? What are its shortcomings, or where can it be improved on? What obviously Nash, you mentioned there's benchmarking going on. Do we have any results, or where do we go for implementation into the actual Celestia protocol? How soon can we imagine it actually going live. So these are kind of the questions that I wanted to explore in the last few minutes.
You're talking, you're asking a researcher when the implementation is going to be done.
We regained. Oh, he's gone.
He's gone.
Yep,
I can quickly like touch on.
Hopefully, we get him back.
I guess further research because all of that is still. All right, Alex, can you hear me talking?
So
I can hear you. Yeah. Wait, Alex, can you hear Nash? He's speaking.
Oh, what's going on?
Yeah, it's gotten weird. I had to reload the page, so maybe that's go for it.
That's weird. I don't want to. Yeah. Okay. Alex is reconnecting. So what I was saying is I can touch upon what's next for me. I'm looking into currently how to do the recursive verification over Zoda, and how to have a construction that gives instant agreement when downloading. And then you can try to benchmark this, for example, also against, let's say, KCG, and have like a direct comparison with numbers. For the actual implementation, it is not big of a change to the Celestia protocol at all. The only thing that you have to do is one, change the field size of the encoding. And then two is after Raja coding the first quadrant, the column-wise bottom, you multiply it by a diagonal matrix that is derived from the commitment of those two quadrants. And only with that additional diagonal multiplication, you basically follow the Raja coding, which means that this upgrade could happen honestly anytime. It just needs implementation to add this diagonal multiplication without any change of the rest of the Celestia network. So all the adoption of actually it's a very gradual implementation, and the part of the encoding is not very hard to implement.
So it's actually like relatively compatible.
You can think of as a drop-in replacement. Like it's literally the same scheme that we are currently doing, just with an additional diagonal multiplication. And then you have to interpret the rows and columns and maybe create the verifier to actually do those samplings. And that's now on the DAS protocol. But on the encoding, it is a very simple adaptation.
But we do, yeah. I guess we need to do the encoding over the 128-bit field, right? That's the big difference. Yeah. Okay.
Two things, right? Different field and the diagonal multiplication, diagonal matrix multiplication.
That's actually
those are the only two changes. Yeah.
That is just insane.
Yeah, the way to think about it is, in some sense, like adding this structure just enables you to add a new type of node. And that node is somewhere between a full node, who does all the re-encoding and downloads the block, and a light node, who right now has to kind of depend on full nodes to alert them whenever they discover something has been incorrectly encoded. And there's now a weird middle node, which acts much closer to a full node than a light node, but has similar communication requirements to a light node, that is simply doing something additional and says, cool, like instead of downloading individual entries, I'm just going to download a few rows and columns. And that will suffice for me to be sure that the encoding is mostly good. And therefore, in the event that something bad happens, if I have enough samples, I can reconstruct the block. And And but otherwise, I mean, the system kind of continues functioning as is, right? There, if you didn't have these middle nodes, right? I get this, barring some small mathematical changes about how the encoding is done, you could remove these nodes in the middle, and the system would look exactly like Celestia does today, even with this like a little additional bit of randomness. So in some sense, like Nash is saying, it's essentially, barring these mathematical changes, it is a drop-in replacement for what Celestia does today, in the sense that everything that all this work that you guys have built up can still be used in this exact protocol with this exact construction, and that doesn't change. So anyway, it's kind of weird. It's all just like feels a little too nice,
Yeah, we could have Zoda verifiers in parallel to our current light nodes that still use proofs.
Exactly.
Like that could be a thing, right?
Wow.
I think the big unlock here and like the eye on the prize to focus on is architecting split up consensus, and then like consensus doing Zoda to get like 10, 100x's of like throughput overall.
Yeah, and I guess there's a lot more work that would need to happen to enable that.
Yeah.
Like enabling Zoda is like one thing, but then to harvest all the downstream benefits is a lot more like engineering and design and everything.
Mm-hmm.
Exactly.
Got it. And Guillermo, I mean, I'm trying to get Alex back up so he can speak. But for you guys, and I guess for Dave, I guess for all of you actually, where you mentioned you have this new paper, I guess, in the hopper. But what are the areas of future research that you guys are like excited to explore down this path that's now been opened up?
So there's a number of things, one of which would be put us too close to the prize, and so we don't want to quite state it yet. But the most obvious ones here are, in some sense, yes, right? Like the light nodes that we have sample sublinearly, and indeed they actually sample quite relatively small amounts of data relative to the complete encoding, and that's enough. But that's still fairly large. You're never just comfortable with like, oh, we did an improvement in most ways, but you want to do an improvement in every possible way, period. So one of the things that we're trying to do gets us to this question is, Zoda nodes are still large. They're very, very small relative to full nodes, but they're still large relative to light nodes, as Celestia has them today. And so the natural question is, look, can we get Zoda to be as close as possible, even or some variation of Zoda or something of the like, to get as close as possible to the light nodes of today while having much stronger guarantees. Maybe it's 50% more data. Light nodes right now downloaded, I believe, something on the order of like maybe under 100 kilobytes or something of the like. The question is, okay, cool. Can we get them to download 150 kilobytes and have the same guarantees that Zoda nodes have today? The next natural question is, cool, okay, if we enable it, can we do that in a way that is still cheaper than any of the protocols that we know today? Perhaps not Celestia, which has quite literally no overhead, but maybe we can incur a tiny little bit of prover overhead or encoder overhead and still get those guarantees. There's questions about how this thing, under certain different trust assumptions, right? There are questions of how Zoda works. One of them being, look, in consensus, we are already assuming an honest majority of participants are good in order for consensus to not split the network and all the stuff. So the natural question is, can we leverage those assumptions that we are already making and therefore use Zoda, for example, as part of consensus, or use Zoda in conjunction with maybe a little bit of extra work for light nodes to get some similar guarantees that they get today without requiring so much download. Those are all kind of, I mean, there's a million other things. There's more mathematical questions. There's questions about does Zoda work in small fields? And if so, how do we do that? Does this construction require other things that we haven't quite yet seen? For example, our construction allows for tensor codes, but it allows for tensor codes that have a kind of particular property, which is that they are the matrix that generates them is fully dense, which is a fucking mouthful, but whatever. right? The point is, okay, cool. Can that be leveraged for different error correcting codes that are more interesting and things like that? There's anything from really, really meaty practical questions about how to implement this in consensus, all the way to really, really deep mathematical questions about how does, sampling a bunch of these weird correlated queries actually help you in detecting whether something was good or not. So anyways, there's all that stuff. If anyone's interested, please feel free to reach out and stuff. But there's way more down the line that is in some ways obvious and in some ways not so obvious as a follow-up work.
For me, the two most interesting ones is one, I guess, question that you guys have alluded. You have a better answer than I thought that existed, which is how are we gonna get all these subcommittees to have their own codes and make a recombined code? The basefold-like idea sounds like even a better idea than basefold, which is cool. Or something basefold-like. But then the second thing that's I think is big to me is actually not cryptographic. It's more P2P side of how are we going to architect local routing? Because I think how this stuff becomes even more impactful is like, okay, great. Let's say we've hit the world where we're at like so much DA throughput. Like we do all these techniques, and I don't know, maybe we get to 10 or a terabyte per second of global DA or something. Okay, well, a lot of the things you want to do is going to look very different than rollups today. So now, the camp of things I've thought of that are interesting that are DA-ish, like actually need this aspect of getting nodes in like a given region to be able to talk to each other quickly and reliably and like get counterparty discovery. Like, if I want to have a website that offloads all computation, today a lot of websites offload computation to a centralized server. There's this thing called server-side rendering. But okay, what if I want that to be to a local SGX? Like, we can post the problem in some DA setting, but then we have to like find the nearest SGX really quickly. And how do we nail this like local routing problem? To me, is kind of the most exciting things. I feel like we have this roadmap now of how we're going to get to super high throughputs, but then how do we nail the local routing questions to now start serving real like Web 2 applications? Let's go solve their infra problems more securely and faster than they have today. And with like more
this is usual Dave being like 5 steps ahead. But yeah, what's really cool about this, Dave, is we kind of came to this idea on Zoda, and then we found your post kind of after constructing it. It's like, you get to the top of the mountain and Dave has kind of been there the whole time asking you what took you so long. The really cool part about the Celestia roadmap and all the work that's happening around DA and zero knowledge proving is that it seems plausible that we can get to Mars on this stuff, that we can actually get really high, very high assurance bandwidth, which we could do really interesting things with. I think the idea that we might get there now automatically opens the question of what do we do once we get there, right? What are we going to build on Mars? And Dave has been doing a lot of really interesting things. I would actually recommend maybe on a future Spaces or in a separate forum teasing out those things. I know it's way too early, like we don't have any of these cool things yet, but I think it's worth starting to dream about what we do when we get there. Yeah, as a parting thought, it's been super fun to work on this with Nash. Guillermo and I have been over many Philly cheesesteaks and afternoons on Fridays. And really enjoyed writing this. It's been a tough paper to write in candor. There's just so many things that we had to learn along the way. And we thank Nash and the Celestia team for being patient and explaining those things to us and understanding the requirements and everything. But yeah, in this paper and in other ones, I hope you've had at least a little bit of fun following along with us, because we've certainly enjoyed the process.
Honestly, it's been so cool seeing the Zoda stuff. Like, been thinking about Stark stuff for years, and there's so many new insights in how you did this. That's really clever, and I think actually will have even like more broader impact outside of like how we think about proving other things, or like the true tweet, reduce systems to being linear and getting CKPs off it. So it's been super cool.
Far too kind.
Yeah, it's been very fun. Also want to shout out to Zanas, who's been with the Celestia team for also taking up a lot of her time as a researcher, helping us out. And also John and Moose, of course, OGs, lecturing us about trust assumptions. Pretty good.
Yes,
Very, very fun. And the work keeps, like, now we have a tool, Zoda as a tool, and then we'll see what we can use and how much we can exploit this tool.
Yeah. Thank you guys so much for all the stuff. It's yeah, it's been super, super fun working with Sanas, Nash, John, Dave, like everybody here. And I'm sure there's people we missed in the acknowledgements, and huge apologies if not, but it's been a blast. This was definitely one of the hardest papers that we've had to write in a long time, but it was well worth it. At least I hope.
Well, you're right. I mean, clearly, you guys just got to keep applying linear algebra everywhere. That's apparently the secret.
Yes, please continue.
We shall. Onwards.
Linear algebra remains severely undervalued.
Yes, there is a lot of alpha in linear algebra, and people still have not discovered this, and this is good.
Amazing. Well, guys, thank you all for coming. Again, congratulations on the paper and the result. Thanks to everyone that's been involved. Lots more work ahead. Pretty insane, mind-blowing, deeply fucked up input on the horizon. We'll look forward to seeing the next iterations of Dave's sharding and the next iterations of this mysterious paper you guys have been alluding to.
Thank you guys for having us.
Yeah, thanks so much.
Thank you.
Cheers.
Cheers, everyone. Thanks for coming.